If you drove through Morgan County, Missouri today and stopped at the right person and asked about a particular stretch of road along the Osage River where an inn once stood, you would get one of two responses. The older residents, those in their 80s and beyond, the ones whose grandparents were alive in 1903, would give you a look that has no name in polite language, and then they would tell you they don't know what you're talking about. The younger residents would tell you they've never heard of it at all. Neither answer is quite the truth. Both of them are, in their own way, exactly what the community decided to offer to the outside world after the spring of 1903, when a traveling merchant's wife in Versailles filed a missing persons inquiry with the Morgan County Sheriff, and the sheriff rode out to the Callum Inn on the River Road and came back a different man than when he left. What Ezra Callum had been operating on that stretch of the Osage River Road for at least 8 years was not an inn in any sense that the word is meant to carry. It was the form of an inn. It had a sign. It had rooms. It had a table and food and a fire in the common room, and it occupied the position that a legitimate roadside inn occupies in the geography of a remote area, a known stopping place, a recognizable feature on a traveler's route, the kind of place you look forward to when you have been on the road all day and the light is failing. It was all of those things on the surface. What it was beneath the surface, what it had been for 8 years at minimum, and possibly longer, is what this story is about. Before we begin, drop your location in the comments and tell me what time it is where you are. The Osage River Road in 1903 had no telegraph and no neighbors within a mile in either direction. I want to know where you are sitting right now. Morgan County, Missouri in 1903 occupied a particular position in the geography of the American interior that made it useful to a man like Ezra Callum. It sat on the eastern edge of the Ozark Plateau, where the terrain began its slow descent toward the Missouri River Valley. The roads through it connected larger population centers, Versailles to the northeast, Lebanon to the southwest, and they were traveled with some regularity by the merchants, drummers, timber agents, and laborers who moved through the interior of Missouri on business that did not require the convenience of a railroad. These were men who traveled alone, by horse or by wagon, carrying cash or goods, on routes that were understood but not closely monitored. They stopped where the road offered stopping places. They paid for a meal and a bed and moved on the next morning, and if they failed to arrive at their destination on time, the inquiry that followed was slow, conducted over long distances, and easily deflected by the simple geography of the region. A man could be overdue by a week before anyone began to wonder in earnest. He could be overdue by 2 weeks before anyone with authority to act had the information necessary to act on it. Ezra Callum understood this geometry precisely. He was 44 years old in 1903, a former laborer from Laclede County who had come to Morgan County in the early 1890s and established the inn on the River Road after acquiring the property through means that were, even by the standards of the period, somewhat unclear. He was a large man, barrel-chested, with a neck that his neighbors described as thick as a fence post, and hands that could span a dinner plate. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of winter sky, and they were described by virtually every witness who testified about him as eyes that seemed to be calculating something continuously, even when the rest of his face was set in the expression of easy hospitality he had apparently perfected. He was known to be a skilled cook. He kept a clean common room. His prices were fair. His fire was always burning when travelers arrived, which suggested that he knew they were coming before they arrived, a detail that struck no one as unusual at the time, because innkeepers on traveled roads often knew the traffic patterns of their route well enough to anticipate guests. A former Pinkerton operative who testified at the trial said, when asked what he made of Callum's demeanor during the arrest, that Callum was the most composed man he had encountered in 17 years of investigative work. He said Callum had offered coffee without any detectable hesitation, had answered questions without any detectable rehearsal, and had shown no elevation in affect or behavior from the moment they arrived until the moment the hatch was opened. He said it was the composure of a man who had made his preparations and was not surprised by what the preparations had eventually produced. He used the word patient. He said Callum had the quality of patience that belonged to a man who had always understood that this moment would come eventually and had arranged himself accordingly. He had never, the operative said, encountered a man who seemed less afraid of being caught. For the first years of the inn's operation, nothing seemed unusual. He was known in the county as a man who ran a decent stopping place and kept to himself outside of business hours. The road traffic through his establishment was steady but not heavy. Perhaps 2 to 4 guests per week in the active seasons, fewer in winter, with a drop-off whenever weather made the river road difficult. Nobody kept a careful accounting of who passed through his doors. Nobody had reason to. This is the part that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something important about how this kind of operation is possible. There was no registry system for travelers on Missouri roads in 1903. There was no expectation that an innkeeper would maintain, let alone share, records of who had stayed under his roof. Travelers who passed through the Ozark interior were expected to be self-sufficient, and the communities through which they moved had no infrastructure for tracking them. A man left home in Versailles, heading for Lebanon, and was expected in Lebanon 3 or 4 days later, and if he did not arrive, the question of where he had stopped along the way was answered by inference and memory rather than documentation. This was normal. This was how the road economy worked, and Ezra Callum had chosen his location on that road with the precision of a man who had thought very carefully about the geometry of visibility and absence, about which routes were traveled by which kind of men, and about the gap between when a man left one place and when his absence from another would become alarming enough to generate official attention. 8 years of operating that calculation successfully in a county that had no reason to look at him, in a state that had no infrastructure to notice what was happening. This was not luck. This was design. The first indication that something was wrong appeared not at the inn itself, but 15 miles away, in the records of a Versailles dry goods merchant named Harlan Stote. Stote kept a meticulous business ledger, a document now held in the Missouri State Archives in Jefferson City, that recorded the names, routes, and expected return dates of the traveling merchants who purchased inventory from his store. Between 1896 and 1903, Stote noted in his ledger 11 instances in which a merchant who had indicated the Osage River Road as part of their route failed to return within their expected window and subsequently made no contact with him. 11. Over 7 years. Stote had noted each instance with a terse marginal annotation, overdue, no return, no word, and had attributed them individually and over time to the ordinary hazards of travel in the Missouri interior. Men changed routes, men had accidents, men found better opportunities and did not return to settle old accounts. It was only when Stote reviewed the full ledger in April 1903, at the prompting of the wife of the most recent missing merchant, that the pattern became visible to him as a pattern rather than as a series of unrelated misfortunes. He brought the ledger to the sheriff's office in Versailles. Sheriff Thomas Gant was 60 years old in 1903. A former farmer who had served as Morgan County Sheriff for 11 years and who had, in that time, dealt with the ordinary violence of a rural Missouri county, the fights, the thefts, the occasional family dispute that ended in ways that required official attention. He was not an imaginative man. He was, however, a thorough one, which was in the end more useful than imagination in this particular situation, because what the Stote ledger required was not a theory but an accounting, a patient cross-referencing of names and dates and routes that a thorough man could do, and that a merely clever one might have moved past too quickly. He spent 2 days at his desk in Versailles before he rode out to the Callum Inn. He sent letters to the sheriffs in adjacent counties asking about travelers reported overdue on the Osage River route in the preceding decade. He checked in with 3 additional suppliers in Versailles and 2 in Stoutland who traded with traveling merchants. When he was done with those 2 days, the number that had seemed troubling in the Stote ledger had grown considerably. He did not share the full number with anyone before he made the ride out to the inn. He carried it by himself for the 4 days it took him to prepare and set out, and he told his deputy Whitfield only what Whitfield needed to know to ride with him safely. He was methodical and fair and not easily alarmed. When Stote placed the ledger in front of him and explained what he had found, Gant reviewed it carefully and said very little. He then spent 2 days making quiet inquiries among other merchants and supply agents who used the Osage River Road. By the time those 2 days were done, he had identified 7 additional individuals who had traveled the river road in the past decade and were unaccounted for. The total number of missing persons connected to the general route and time period of Ezra Callum's inn, 18, possibly more if the records of smaller operators and less organized merchants were factored in. Gant rode out to the Callum Inn on the morning of April 14, 1903, accompanied by his deputy, a man named Whitfield, and by a special deputy he had sworn in specifically for this purpose, a former Pinkerton operative named Claude Reyes, who happened to be in Versailles on unrelated business and whom Gant asked to accompany him. He later said he had asked Reyes along because he wanted someone with him who had seen more of what human beings could do to one another than he had. Callum received them at the door of the inn with the same practiced hospitality he showed every visitor. He offered coffee. He answered questions about the specific missing merchant with fluent ease. Yes, the man had stopped there. He recalled him well. He had eaten and slept and ridden out the next morning in good health and good spirits, heading south. He was cooperative in a way that was so complete and so immediate that Gant noted it in his subsequent report as itself a kind of irregularity. A man with nothing to hide does not, in Gant's experience, have the answers that thoroughly prepared. George Wallen's brother was not with them. Gant had left him in Versailles on the firm grounds that a man searching for his missing brother was not the right person to bring along on an inquiry that required patience and careful observation. He had made this decision after one conversation with George Wallen that had made clear that Wallen intended, if given the opportunity, to conduct his own inquiry in a manner that would not benefit the legal proceedings Gant was trying to preserve. It was the right call. What happened in that common room required exactly the kind of methodical calm that George Wallen was not going to be capable of in a room with the man he suspected of knowing what had happened to his brother. Reyes asked to see the cellar. What prompted the request was a detail he noticed while Callum was speaking, a faint discoloration in the floorboard near the hearthstone of the common room, a darker stain than the ordinary soot and grease of years of cooking and foot traffic. Reyes had seen floors like it before in a different context, in a different state, in a different line of work. He asked about the cellar without explaining why. Callum said there was no cellar. Reyes pointed to the iron pull ring set into the hearthstone. The silence that followed lasted, according to Deputy Whitfield's statement, approximately 4 seconds. Then Callum moved toward the door at the back of the common room, and Reyes moved faster, and whatever Callum had intended when he moved toward that door, he did not accomplish. The hatch beneath the hearthstone opened onto a cellar that was not used for food storage. It was a space of approximately 12 feet by 18 feet, with a limestone floor and walls and a ceiling low enough that a standing man would stoop. The smell that came up through the hatch when it was opened was the smell that Reyes had expected from the moment he saw the floor. He described it in his statement to the Morgan County Circuit Court as the accumulated evidence of a significant period of systematic activity. The official record does not go further than that in its description of the cellar's contents. The private correspondence between Gant and the circuit court judge, letters held in the Morgan County Historical Society in Versailles, describes the contents in considerably more detail that was withheld from the public record on the grounds that it served no purpose in the prosecution that would benefit from public knowledge. What the cellar established was this: Ezra Callum had not simply killed his guests. He had operated the inn as a mechanism for identifying, isolating, and dispatching travelers who were unlikely to be quickly missed, and he had done this in an organized fashion over a period of years. The cellar contained physical evidence, tools, materials, and items of personal property belonging to individuals who had never checked out of the inn that the circuit court's appointed examiner, a physician named Dr. Aldous Crane, brought from Jefferson City for the purpose, assessed as representing a minimum of 9 victims, possibly substantially more. The physical evidence of the oldest material in the cellar was consistent with activity dating to within a year or two of Callum's acquisition of the property. The question of what Callum had done with the physical remains of his victims, beyond the material that was present in the cellar, was not fully answered at trial. The property sat on a stretch of the Osage River that was deep and fast-running and the circuit court's examination of the riverbank in the vicinity of the inn found evidence that was consistent with the hypothesis the investigators formed, but the river was not cooperative in providing confirmation. Ezra Callum was tried in Morgan County Circuit Court in the autumn of 1903. The trial lasted 4 days. He was convicted of murder in the first degree on 3 counts, the 3 for which the evidence was most direct and the identification of the victim most certain. He was sentenced to death by hanging. He was executed at the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City in February 1904. He made no statement before his execution and no statement at any point during the proceedings. A newspaper reporter from the Jefferson City Tribune who attended the execution wrote that Callum spent the last moments looking at the assembled witnesses with an expression the reporter described as one of mild curiosity, as though he were observing something that interested him but did not concern him. The trial of Ezra Callum was covered by the Jefferson City Tribune and the Sedalia Democrat, both of which sent reporters to Versailles for the proceedings. Both newspapers reported on the conviction and the sentence in terms that were factual, but that stopped well short of the specifics that the Morgan County Circuit Court file contains. The Tribune reporter who attended the execution wrote the most detailed account published in any Missouri newspaper during the entire period, 12 column inches that described the inn, the cellar, the investigation, and the conviction without naming the number of the victims or the nature of the evidence in the cellar. This was based on the notes in his papers at the Missouri History Museum in St. Louis, not because he did not know the specifics, but because his editor had determined that Morgan County readers did not need to carry the full weight of them. He filed his full notes separately. They remained in his private papers, unpublished, for 60 years. The inn on the River Road was demolished by the county in the summer of 1903, the cellar filled and the site cleared. The property was listed for sale and found no buyer for 11 years. It was eventually acquired as part of a larger farm holding, and the land plowed into an ordinary field. No marker was ever placed. The road itself was rerouted in the 1920s when a new bridge was constructed downstream, and the stretch that passed the old inn location became a farm track, then a path, then nothing. Today there is a field there, and a line of old sycamores along the river, and no visible indication that anything stood on that ground, or that anything happened there. The Stote Ledger in the Missouri State Archives in Jefferson City records 18 names beside which the notation "No Return" appears, and the route notes reference the Osage River Road. Of those 18, 3 were positively identified as Callum's victims during the trial. The other 15 remain, in the formal legal sense, unresolved. Their names are in the ledger. The ledger is in the archive. If you know where to look, you can read them. Here is the question that Ezra Callum poses, and it is one that goes beyond the specific horror of what he did. He operated not despite the hospitality he offered, but through it. The inn worked as a mechanism precisely because it was a real inn, warm, functional, welcoming, providing exactly what a tired traveler needed. The evil was not separate from the service. The evil was the service, extended one step further than the guest expected. He chose his victims based on their vulnerability to the specific conditions he had created. Alone, in a remote location, expected somewhere that was far enough away and connected loosely enough that their absence would take time to register. He was not a man who acted on impulse. He was a man who built a system, operated it patiently for years, and adapted it when necessary. The inn on the Osage River Road was not the scene of a crime. It was an instrument designed and maintained for one purpose. The question is whether that kind of deliberate, sustained, patient construction of a killing mechanism represents a category of evil separate from and darker than violence that arises from rage or opportunity, or whether the premeditation and the patience are simply what evil looks like when it is given enough time and enough isolation to fully express itself. Monster by design or monster by circumstance, given enough room to build. Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know which one keeps you up at night. If these buried histories are what you come here for, and you want to go further into the cases that the official record sealed and the communities agreed to forget, subscribe and ring the bell. We are not done yet. Not even close. The river keeps what it was given. It has kept it for over 100 years. And here is the final detail that the official record contains and that no one has acted on. The Stoat Ledger in Jefferson City lists 18 names. 3 of those names were positively identified in the trial. The other 15 remain listed as no return. They have been listed that way for 120 years. The ledger is in a climate-controlled archive. The names are legible. If you know where to look, you can read every one of them. The people who carried those names had families, had origins, had debts and letters, and people who expected them to come home. 15 of them never became anything more than a marginal notation in a merchant's account book and a cold trail on a Missouri road. Remember that the next time you stop somewhere unfamiliar on a long drive, somewhere that looks warm from the road, somewhere with a fire already going, think about the geometry of visibility. Think about the gap between when you left and when someone will start to wonder,